A man who once filled arenas of 80,000 people learned his marriage was over through a fax. That same man, who crossed the Atlantic on Concorde to perform on 2 continents in a single day, sat alone, holding a piece of paper, not knowing who he was without the drums his hands could no longer play. This is not a metaphor. This is Phil Collins. For 5 decades, he was the heartbeat of a generation, the voice behind songs that followed millions through their most private moments. But behind the sold-out tours, the Grammys, and the record-breaking sales, a man was quietly coming apart, broken by loss, betrayed by his own body, and haunted by the silence that fame, however enormous, could never fill. How did the boy from West London become one of the most successful artists of his generation? And why has no one told the full price he paid to stay there? What really happens when the body that built an empire finally says no? To answer that, we need to go back to where it all began. Philip David Charles Collins was born on January 30th, 1951, in Chiswick, a quiet corner of West London where ambition was not a word spoken at dinner tables. His father, Greville Collins, sold insurance for a living, a steady, unremarkable man who provided security, but not spark. His mother, June, worked as a theatrical agent, a woman with one foot permanently planted in the world of performance, of lights, of possibility. It was from her that Phil inherited something dangerous, a hunger. By the age of 5, that hunger had already found its instrument. A toy drum kit placed under a Christmas tree changed everything. Most children abandon such gifts within weeks. Phil never did. He played until his hands ached. He played until the neighbors complained. And he played as though the drums were not an instrument, but a language, the only one that made complete sense to him. His parents recognized early that this was not a hobby. It was a calling. They enrolled him at the Barbara Speake Stage School in London, where performance was not an extracurricular. It was the curriculum. Phil thrived. He was sharp, quick, magnetic in the way only naturally gifted children can be, carrying a restless energy that classrooms could barely contain. At 13, he appeared as a background extra in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles film that captured the eruption of a generation. It was a blink-and-miss-it moment on screen, but standing on that set, breathing the same air as the most famous band on Earth, something locked into place inside him. He would later recall feeling not starstruck, but certain, "This is where I belong." The stage called louder with every passing year. As a teenager, he played the artful Dodger in the London stage production of Oliver, a role that demanded not just music, but presence, character, command. He delivered all 3. Audiences noticed, directors noticed. But more importantly, Phil noticed something about himself. He was not afraid of being seen. In a world that punishes sensitivity, that is a rare and dangerous gift. By the late 1960s, he was moving through the London music scene with restless purpose, drumming in a series of bands that never quite ignited. One of them, Flaming Youth, released an album in 1969 that flickered briefly before fading into obscurity. Another door closed. Another verdict of not yet. Then, in 1970, a small advertisement appeared in Melody Maker magazine. A progressive rock band called Genesis was looking for a drummer. Phil auditioned in the open air of a garden in Surrey, playing Beneath the Sky as though auditioning for something far larger than a band. He got the job. Genesis, at that point, was a collection of privately educated young men. Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford. They wrote music of labyrinthine complexity and performed in elaborate costumes and theatrical masks. They were intellectually ambitious, critically admired, and commercially invisible. Phil slid into the drum seat not as a star, but as a craftsman. Reliable, powerful, technically brilliant. For years, he was exactly what bands need but rarely celebrate. The engine nobody thinks about until it stops running. See, while Gabriel commanded the stage in fox heads and flower costumes, Phil sat behind the kit, holding everything together with a precision that left fellow musicians quietly speechless. He did not complain. He did not demand. He played. But invisibility, as Phil Collins would one day prove to the entire world, is only ever temporary for those who refuse to accept it as permanent. The band grew. The tours lengthened. The albums deepened. Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, selling England by the pound. Genesis was becoming something real, something that mattered to a growing and devoted audience. And Phil, still behind the kit, still in the shadows of Gabriel's theatrics, was absorbing everything, watching, learning, waiting. He did not know it yet, but the moment that would redefine not just his career, but the entire trajectory of Genesis. It was already approaching, and when it arrived, it would arrive without warning. In 1975, Peter Gabriel walked away from Genesis. To the music world, it felt like an ending. Gabriel was the face, the voice, the theatrical heart of everything the band had built. Without him, the common verdict was swift and merciless. Genesis was finished. A footnote. Another band that burned bright and collapsed the moment its most visible member chose a different road. The remaining members, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Phil Collins, disagreed. Quietly, stubbornly, they disagreed. The search for a new lead vocalist began. Over 400 singers auditioned, 400 voices, each one measured against the ghost of what Genesis had been. None of them fit. The band grew frustrated. The process stalled. And then, almost by accident, someone suggested the obvious. What about Phil? He had sung backing vocals for years. Small harmonies, quiet contributions, the kind of singing that supports without demanding attention. Nobody had thought to ask whether there was more. Phil himself was uncertain. Stepping from behind the drums and into the spotlight felt less like an opportunity and more like an exposure. A test he was not sure he could pass. He passed it completely. His voice, warm, vulnerable, capable of shifting from a whisper to a raw emotional cry without warning, was unlike anything rock audiences expected from a drummer stepping reluctantly into the front. It carried something Gabriel's theatrical power never quite reached. Intimacy. The sound of a real person, unguarded, speaking directly into your chest. Genesis did not collapse without Peter Gabriel. Under Phil Collins, they transformed. Albums like A Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering proved the band had not just survived the transition. They had evolved. Commercially and critically, Genesis entered a new chapter, one defined less by theatrical spectacle and more by emotional directness. Phil's presence changed the temperature of the music itself, and the audiences followed. But it was what happened in 1981, away from Genesis entirely, that shook the world. Sitting alone in his home studio, processing the wreckage of his first marriage, Phil began recording. Not for an audience, not for a label, for survival. The result was a track built on a drum pattern so distinctive, so hypnotic, so immediately recognizable that it would one day be ranked among the most iconic musical moments of the 20th century. In the Air Tonight. In the opening is silence. Then that piano. Then the voice, quiet and haunted, carrying the weight of a man who has nothing left to lose by telling the truth. And then, at 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the drums arrive. An explosion so sudden and so powerful that it has startled millions of listeners for over 4 decades. A moment so perfect, it feels less composed than discovered, as though it had always existed somewhere in the air, waiting for someone broken enough to find it. The song was not just a hit, it was a revelation. It announced Phil Collins not as a drummer with a side project, but as one of the most emotionally compelling solo artists of his generation. What followed was extraordinary by any measure. Albums like Face Value, Hello, I Must Be Going, and No Jacket Required sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. Singles like You Can't Hurry, Love, Susudio, Against All Odds, and Another Day in Paradise dominated charts across continents and across years. He won Grammys. He won an Oscar. He performed at both venues of Live Aid in 1985, London and Philadelphia on the same day, crossing the Atlantic on Concorde. A feat so absurd it became instantly legendary. For a brief, dazzling stretch of the 1980s, Phil Collins was quite possibly the most commercially successful solo artist on the planet. And he was still the drummer of Genesis. The dual career was relentless, recording, touring, producing for other artists. He produced Invisible Touch for Genesis while simultaneously managing his own solo machine. He barely slept. He barely stopped. And the boy who had once played a toy drum kit until his hands ached had become a man who treated exhaustion as a price worth paying. He did not yet understand that the body keeps a ledger, and that eventually, without mercy or negotiation, it always collects what it is owed. There is a cruel arithmetic to relentless ambition. For every hour spent chasing greatness, something else pays the bill. For Phil Collins, the currency of his success was measured not in money or critical praise, but in the slow, quiet destruction of every intimate relationship he ever tried to build. He was married 3 times. Each marriage began with genuine love. Each one ended in devastation. And the thread connecting all 3 was the same unmerciful truth. Phil Collins was always, in the deepest sense, somewhere else. His first wife was Andrea Bertarelli, a Canadian woman he met in his early 20s and married in 1975. She was warm, grounded, everything the chaos of the music world was not. They had a son together, Simon, and Phil adopted Andrea's daughter Jolie from a previous relationship. For a brief window, it looked like balance was possible. Family in one hand, music in the other. But Genesis was consuming everything. Tours stretched across continents and months. Recording sessions swallowed entire seasons. Phil was physically present so rarely that presence itself lost meaning. Andrea did not leave him for another man or another life. She left because there was simply no husband there to stay for. The marriage ended in 1980, and from its wreckage came In the Air Tonight. Perhaps the most devastating example in music history of turning private ruin into public art. The song made him a global star. The marriage it mourned was already ash. His second marriage arrived quickly, as second marriages often do when a man is running from silence. Jill Tavelman, an American woman he met in Los Angeles, became his wife in 1984. Their daughter Lily was born in 1989. The same Lily Collins who would one day become a celebrated actress in her own right. For a moment, fatherhood softened him. Those who knew him then recalled a man who seemed genuinely moved by domesticity, by the smallness and warmth of family life. But the machine did not stop. The tours continued. The albums kept coming. Genesis reunited. Solo commitments multiplied. Phil was chasing something he could never quite name. A satisfaction always one more hit away. One more stadium. One more standing ovation beyond the horizon. Jill waited. Then she stopped waiting. The divorce was finalized in 1994. Lily was 5 years old. Phil later admitted, with the particular sadness of a man who understands damage only in retrospect, on that he was not the father he should have been during those years. The admission cost him something. It always does when it comes too late. Then came the third marriage, and with it, the moment that would follow Phil Collins for the rest of his public life. Oriane Seve was a Swiss translator, 17 years his junior, whom he met in 1994 when she was hired to interpret during a business meeting. She was striking, direct, and completely unintimidated by his fame. Qualities that undid him completely. They married in 1999. 2 sons followed, Nicholas and Matthew. For a time, friends described Phil as genuinely happy. More present, more human than they had seen him in years. It did not last. In 2006, the marriage collapsed. Phil was living in Switzerland, geographically distant from everything and everyone he had built his career around, and the isolation had carved a hollow in him he did not know how to fill. The divorce from Oriane was not just painful. It was, by his own account, annihilating. The detail the world could not stop talking about was the method of notification. According to Phil, he discovered the marriage was over through a fax, a single printed page delivered to him while he was alone, informing him that his wife was leaving. Whether the full story carried more complexity than that single detail, the image it burned into the public imagination was searing. One of the most famous men on earth, sitting in silence, holding a piece of paper that told him he was alone again. He would later say, quietly and without theatrics, "It's not a nice way to find out your marriage is over." 7 words, carrying the full weight of a man who had spent a lifetime giving the world everything, and come home, again and again, to nothing. There are men who are defined by what they create, and there are men who are defined by what they lose. Phil Collins, in the cruelest chapter of his physical life, became both at once. A man whose identity was inseparable from his body, watching that body dismantle itself piece by piece, with no negotiation and no appeal. It began with his hearing. For decades, Phil had sat at the center of an assault of sound that most human ears were never designed to survive. Night after night, year after year, the drums exploded around him at volumes that shook the air in enclosed spaces, filled stadiums, traveled through bone as much as air. He wore ear protection when he remembered. He forgot more often than he should have. The industry knew the risks. Most musicians simply chose not to think about them. By the early 2000s, the consequences arrived. The hearing loss was gradual at first, the kind that whispers before it screams. Certain frequencies began to blur. Conversations in loud rooms became exercises in guesswork. Music, the very thing that had structured his entire existence, began to sound different, flattened, incomplete, as though someone were slowly drawing a curtain across the one window through which he had always understood the world. The diagnosis confirmed what he already feared. Significant hearing damage in both ears, the direct and irreversible result of a lifetime spent inside the thunder he had created. There was no surgical fix, no medication that could restore what the years had taken. Only management, adaptation, acceptance, the hardest of the 3. But the hearing was only the beginning. In 2009, Or Phil suffered a serious injury to his upper spine. The damage was not from a single dramatic accident, but from something far more insidious. Decades of the precise, repetitive physical motion of drumming, compounded by poor posture and the particular strain of holding a microphone while performing. The nerves in his hands began to fail. Grip weakened. Coordination faltered. The fingers that had moved with instinctive, almost supernatural precision across a drum kit began to betray him. He tried to compensate. He adapted his technique, modified his grip, worked with specialists and therapists who did their best against a problem that was structural, progressive, and unforgiving. The efforts bought time. They did not change the verdict. By the time Genesis reunited for their Turn It On Again tour in 2007, Phil was already accommodating damage the audience could not see. He sang standing at the front of the stage while a separate drummer sat behind the kit. A concession that cost him something private and profound. The man who had always been both the heartbeat and the voice of every room he entered was now, for the first time, only half of what he had been. The toll was not just physical. It was existential. Drumming was not something Phil Collins did. It was something Phil Collins was. From the age of 5, the relationship between his hands and a drum kit had been the most constant, most honest, most unbreakable bond of his life. Marriages had ended. Friendships had fractured. Fame had twisted and distorted everything it touched. But the drums had always been there, solid, reliable, asking nothing but effort and returning everything. And to feel that bond dissolving was, by his own account, a grief unlike any other he had known. He spoke about it rarely and only in fragments, the way people speak about losses too large for complete sentences. "I can't hold a drumstick properly," he admitted in one interview, the words arriving quietly, without drama, which made them land harder than any theatrical confession could have. It's frustrating. It's more than frustrating. More than frustrating. 2 words doing the work of a eulogy. His son Nico, had by then begun learning the drums, guided by his father's broken hands, showing what his broken hands could no longer demonstrate fully. There was something unbearably poetic about it. The instrument passing from father to son, not in triumph, but in surrender. Not as a gift freely given, but as a torch handed over by a man who could no longer carry it. The body that had built an empire had finally submitted its resignation. And Phil Collins, for the first time in his life, did not know who he was without it. When a man loses the thing that made him whole, he does not simply grieve and move forward. He searches, desperately and often destructively, for something to fill the space where that thing used to live. For Phil Collins, stripped of his drums, hollowed by divorce, and increasingly invisible in a music industry that had moved on without waiting for him, that search led somewhere dark. It led to the bottom of a bottle. The drinking had existed in the background for years. The kind of drinking that hides easily inside the rituals of the music world, where excess is normalized and celebrated and rarely questioned until it is far too late. Late nights on tour, after-show rituals, the particular loneliness of hotel rooms in cities where nobody knew your name beyond the marquee outside. But after the collapse of his 3rd marriage, after the nerve damage rendered drumming a source of pain rather than salvation, and after the public simply stopped paying the kind of attention that had once felt like oxygen, the drinking moved from the background to the center. It became, as he would later admit with devastating honesty, his primary relationship. He retreated to his mansion in Switzerland, a property of extraordinary beauty and almost unbearable silence. Friends described visiting him during those years and finding a man who seemed to be disappearing in plain sight. Not dramatically, not in the way tabloids enjoy, quietly, room by room, day by day. A man of enormous talent and almost no purpose, filling the hours with alcohol and the particular numbness it offers to those who can afford enough of it. But the public retirement announcement came in 2011. He told the world he was stepping back from music entirely. The statement was received with a mixture of respect and relief by an industry that had quietly moved him from the present tense to the past. Tributes were written. Retrospectives were published. The implicit message was clear. Phil Collins was finished. What those tributes did not capture was the reality behind the retirement. It was not a graceful bow from a fulfilled man choosing peace. It was, by his own later confession, a surrender. A white flag raised not in satisfaction, but in exhaustion. He was tired in a way that sleep could not touch. Tired of performing. Tired of pretending. Tired of being Phil Collins in a world that had decided it no longer needed him. His children grew up largely without him during those years. Lily, his daughter from his second marriage, was building her own career in Hollywood, carving her own identity carefully and deliberately apart from his shadow. Simon, his eldest son, lived his own life at a quiet distance. Nicholas and Matthew, his youngest boys, were still children, and Phil, submerged in his own wreckage, was not consistently present for them in the ways that mattered most. He later spoke about this period with the unflinching honesty of a man who has survived something and chosen not to sanitize it. I was drinking too much. I wasn't in a good place. I wasn't the father I should have been. The confession arrived without excuses or deflection. Simply the plain, heavy truth of a man taking inventory of what his darkest years had cost. At his lowest point, he considered never returning to music at all. The idea of stepping onto a stage again felt not just unlikely, but meaningless. What was the point of performing when the hands could not drum, when the voice carried the wear of decades, when the audience had already said its goodbye? The answer, when it came, did not arrive through ambition or discipline or the revival of professional hunger. It arrived through his son. Nicholas Collins was 14 years old when he sat behind a drum kit and played with a precision that made grown musicians stop and stare. He had learned by watching videos, by studying recordings, by absorbing through instinct and obsession what his father could no longer teach through demonstration. The talent was undeniable. But more than the talent, it was the image itself that reached through Phil's darkness and pulled him upright. His own son, behind the instrument that had defined his life, playing with the same hunger Phil had carried at 5 years old in a living room in West London. Something shifted. If Nico could play, Phil could at least stand beside him. If the drums were no longer his to command, he could still offer his voice. And if his voice still carried, still moved people, he still told the truth of a life fully and painfully lived, then perhaps the retirement had been premature. Perhaps the white flag had been raised too soon. In 2017, Phil Collins ended his retirement. The announcement was characteristically understated. "I'm back," he said simply, with the faint, self-aware smile of a man who understood the absurdity and the sincerity of the statement in equal measure. The world, which had written its tributes and moved on, turned back around. The Not Dead Yet Tour, the name chosen with deliberate, darkly comic precision, brought him back to stages across the world. He performed seated, his damaged body no longer capable of the physical command that had once defined his presence. A stool replaced the swagger. A cane was visible in photographs taken before and after shows. His voice, weathered and deeper than it once was, carried something the younger version had never possessed. Weight. The unmistakable weight of a man singing from the other side of everything. Audiences did not mourn what time had taken. They responded to what remained. Arenas filled. Standing ovations arrived not from nostalgia alone, but from the recognition of something rare. An artist who had survived his own destruction and returned not triumphant, but honest. Then, Genesis called one final time. The last Domino reunion tour of 2021 and 2022 brought Phil back together with Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford for what all three acknowledged would be their final chapter together. Nico sat behind the drum kit, his father's drum kit, on his father's stage, while Phil stood at the front, his microphone in hand, singing the songs that had built the cathedral they were now closing. The image was almost too symbolic to bear. Father and son sharing the stage, the legacy passing in real time from one generation to the next. Those who witnessed it described something that transcended a concert. It was a farewell, yes, but it was also a reconciliation. Phil making peace with what his body had taken, with what the years had cost, with the instrument he could no longer play, by giving it to the person he loved most. Off stage, quieter reconciliations were also taking root. His relationship with Lily grew warmer, more honest. With Simon, conversations resumed that distance and silence had interrupted. With Nico and Matthew, presence replaced absence. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. He could not rewrite the years he had lost. To no apology, however sincere, returns a childhood to a child who grew up waiting. But Phil Collins stopped pretending those years had not happened. He looked at them directly. He owned them. And in doing so, he offered his children something rarer than fame or fortune: the truth of a father willing to be seen. Today, Phil Collins is 73 years old. He moves carefully, deliberately, with the measured pace of a man who has learned, through pain rather than wisdom, that the body is not a machine, but a covenant, one that punishes those who forget its terms. The hearing aids are permanent. The nerve damage in his hands is irreversible. The spine that has carried decades of thunder behind a drum kit reminds him daily, with quiet cruelty, of every night he chose the stage over sleep. He manages it all with the particular grace of someone who has stopped fighting what cannot be changed and started protecting what still remains. His world is smaller now, deliberately, gratefully smaller. Morning routines built around health rather than schedules. Afternoons that belong to Nico and Matthew rather than boardrooms or studios. Evenings that end not in hotel bars or strategy meetings, but in the ordinary, irreplaceable silence of a home where people know his name for reasons that have nothing to do with platinum records. He has said in recent years that he does not miss the machine. He misses the music. There is a difference, one he perhaps could not have articulated at the height of his fame, but understands completely now. The music was always true. The machine was always hungry. And yet, when you trace the full arc of his life, the toy drum kit in West London, the garden audition that changed everything, the voice that emerged from heartbreak and became a generation's companion, the marriages that crumbled under the weight of ambition, the body that surrendered piece by piece, and the dark years of silence and disappearance. What remains is not a cautionary tale. It is something more honest than that. It is the story of a man who gave everything he had, lost almost everything that mattered, and found his way back through the one door that was always open. Not the stage door. The front door. The one his children were standing behind. Phil Collins gave the world 5 decades of himself. His talent, his pain, his marriages, his failures. His voice cracking open in recording studios at 3 in the morning because there was no other honest way to say what needed saying. What the world gave back was applause. What his children gave back was something the applause could never replicate. A reason to still be here.